Badge number and the name of your supervisor. You need to step back, sir.
I am entitled to that information. Badge number, now. Gate H, non-compliant passenger.
I am not non-compliant. I have done nothing wrong.
There are cases that get filed and forgotten. This one rewrote department policy, emptied a command structure, and produced a verdict that made national legal history. What happened inside Chicago Union Station on a Thursday morning began as a routine commute, a federal judge traveling to Washington for an emergency appellate session. It ended with that judge face down on a concourse floor, in handcuffs, while a transit officer stood over him, and a body camera the officer had reported as destroyed recorded every second of it. The recording survived, the cover-up didn't. If you are new here, subscribe and drop your location in the comments. This channel covers stories that deserve more than a headline, and this is one of the most important ones posted here. Here is exactly what happened. Chicago Union Station moves fast on a Thursday morning. 6:53. The main concourse was running at full capacity, commuters in overcoats cutting toward platforms, business travelers pulling roller bags across the marble floor. Amtrak staff moving in uniform clusters between the gates. The Great Hall hummed with the particular energy of a transit hub that never fully stops. Overhead announcements cycled through departures. Ticket barriers opened and closed in steady rhythm. A man joined the priority boarding corridor near Gate H. 54 years old. Dark wool overcoat, leather document bag, the measured stride of someone who had spent decades moving through institutional spaces without breaking pace. His rail travel credentials and federal identification were already out, held forward, visible, ready. He had been traveling this route for years. He knew the drill. An officer positioned near the corridor entrance was already watching him. The officer stepped forward before the man reached the gate and told him the priority corridor was for verified passengers only. He said general boarding was at the far end of the concourse. He said it loudly. The man stopped. He extended his credentials and stated clearly that he was a federal judge on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, traveling on official judicial business. The officer took the identification. He examined it for 2 seconds. He handed it back without running the verification scanner, without checking the federal court seal, without comparing the photograph to the man standing in front of him. He told him to step to the side for additional screening. Behind him, a white man in a fleece vest walked through the corridor without being asked for anything. A white woman with a rolling suitcase was waved forward. 2 white men in suits passed through in conversation without breaking stride. None of them were stopped. None of them were looked at twice. His name was Judge Marcus Elroy. Born on the south side of Chicago, the second of 3 sons raised by a transit worker and a public school librarian. He was the first in his family to graduate from university, the first to pass the bar, and the first to be appointed to the federal bench in the Northern District of Illinois. He graduated at the top of his class from the University of Chicago Law School, turned down 3 private sector offers before accepting a position with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and spent 21 years prosecuting federal cases, racketeering, public corruption, civil rights violations, law enforcement misconduct. He had stood in Chicago federal courtrooms and argued cases against organized crime networks, against aldermen who had sold city contracts, against officers who had used their badges as instruments of personal authority. He had won most of them. When the president nominated him to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, the Senate confirmed him 86-11. His opinions on equal protection and due process were taught at Northwestern, Georgetown, and the University of Michigan. Legal scholars described his appointment as one of the most consequential the Seventh Circuit had seen in 15 years. That morning he was traveling to Washington for an emergency en banc session, a full-panel hearing on federal mandatory minimum sentencing that required his physical presence in the courtroom by 1 o'clock in the afternoon. His document bag contained his federal judicial identification, his Amtrak federal travel authorization, a letter of diplomatic courtesies issued by the U.S. Marshals Service, and briefing materials he had been reviewing since 5 in the morning. He had made this trip from Chicago more than 40 times. He had never once been questioned at the gate. Officer Shane Dooley, 44, had been with the Chicago Union Station Transit Authority Police for 13 years. His personnel file contained 22 formal complaints. 18 of those complaints came from Black or Latino passengers. The pattern across those 18 complaints was consistent racial profiling at priority boarding areas, unlawful detention, verbal intimidation, and physical force applied to compliant individuals. Not one complaint had reached a disciplinary panel, not one had resulted in suspension or retraining. His direct supervisor, Lieutenant Kevin Price, 51, had processed every dismissal. Insufficient grounds, inconsistent accounts, no independent corroboration. Dooley had been given a commendation in his 9th year for outstanding service in high-traffic passenger management. He was known among colleagues for his positioning. He preferred the priority boarding corridors and first-class waiting areas, the parts of the station that he had told fellow officers were magnets for people who thought their ticket entitled them to something extra. A black federal prosecutor had been detained in the priority waiting lounge for 90 minutes in 2020. A black Illinois state senator had been redirected from priority boarding 4 times across 3 years and had filed 4 complaints, each dismissed within 2 weeks. A black retired Chicago Police Department superintendent, a man who had run the city's entire law enforcement apparatus, had been told at this same gate that his credentials needed additional verification before he could proceed. Every complaint dismissed. Every time. By the time Shane Dooley stepped into Marcus Elroy's path that Thursday morning, he had been operating this way for 13 years without a single sustained consequence. Judge Elroy was not a situation that had developed. He was a choice that had already been made. Dooley radioed for backup and described the judge as a non-compliant passenger creating a disturbance. Judge Elroy had not raised his voice. He had not moved without instruction. He had not made any physical gesture that could be read as threatening. He had asked, in clear and measured language, for Dooley's badge number and the name of his on-duty supervisor information. Any member of the public was legally entitled to request from a transit officer. Dooley grabbed him by the collar. Not a directional touch, a grip, both hands closing on the lapels of the judge's wool overcoat and pulling him sideways with force that spun him off balance. His document bag hit the marble floor, and the clasp buckled. Federal court briefs, the marshal's service letter, the en banc session schedule scattered across the concourse floor in a wide spread. Commuters nearby stopped walking. Phones came up. A station worker near the newsstand took 2 steps forward and then stopped. Dooley drove him toward the low steel barrier beside the gate and shoved him forward. Judge Elroy's shoulder struck the metal edge hard. He called out. His reading glasses flew from his face and skidded across the floor. Dooley forced both arms behind his back, put his knee into the back of the judge's right leg, and drove him down to the concourse floor, face forward, onto the marble. In the main hall of Chicago Union Station, in front of hundreds of commuters. He had not resisted. He had not raised a hand. He had not done anything from the moment Dooley first stepped into his path that justified a single second of what was happening to him. Dooley put his knee into the back of Judge Elroy's neck and reached for his cuffs. He said at full volume, into a concourse with hundreds of witnesses and 6 security cameras running, that people like him always had to make everything into a confrontation. Judge Elroy's cheek was against the marble floor. His voice was controlled. He told Dooley he was a federal judge, that this was assault under color of law, that every second of it was being recorded. Dooley told him to keep talking. He locked the handcuffs. 6 security cameras captured everything. Not one of them missed a frame. What Shane Dooley did not know what would cost him the next several years of his life was that his own body camera had been recording since 6:41 that morning. The first call reached Transit Authority Police Chief Gerald Boone at 7:04. The second came 90 seconds later. The third was from the office of a Chicago alderman who had already been sent the clip by a commuter who filmed the entire sequence from 30 feet away. Boone was 58 years old, 22 years in transit law enforcement, the kind of institutional fixture who had survived 3 mayoral administrations by knowing which problems required visibility and which ones required containment. He arrived at Gate H 11 minutes after the handcuffs went on, moving with the pace of a man who understood that every additional minute was compounding something he could not yet measure. He pulled Station Concourse Supervisor Diane Riley aside before he reached the scene and asked her what she had. She told him who was on the floor. What crossed Boone's face in the 2 seconds that followed was not the expression of a man responding to a crisis. It was the expression of a man who had just understood the specific nature of a problem that was already past the point of internal management. He walked to Dooley and told him quietly to remove the cuffs. Dooley said the subject had been non-compliant and that witnesses would confirm the threat assessment. Boone said the subject's name, his court, and his Senate confirmation number in that order, in a voice low enough that only Dooley could hear it. The cuffs came off. When Judge Elroy was helped to his feet, left shoulder visibly dropped, the side of his face marked where it had contacted the marble, overcoat torn at the left lapel. Boone stepped close and dropped his voice to near nothing. He mentioned the station's private security office. He mentioned a department physician. He began to describe a review process that could be initiated internally with appropriate discretion before any external notification was made. Judge Elroy looked at him. He had spent 21 years prosecuting the sentence Boone was in the middle of constructing. He had sent 3 people to federal prison for completing it. He told Boone exactly that. He looked up at the camera, bracketed to the column above the gate. Then he looked back at the chief and told him the review process had already started and it was not going to be internal. A woman had pushed through the commuter crowd while Dooley's knee was still on the judge's neck. Patricia Hollins, 56, was a retired assistant U.S. attorney who had spent 28 years in the Northern District of Illinois. She had litigated 3 cases before Judge Elroy on the district bench before his circuit appointment. She recognized him from across the concourse the moment Dooley grabbed his collar. She identified herself by name and former title, raised her phone, and placed a 911 call in real time. Assault in progress, transit police officer, federal appellate judge, Chicago Union Station main concourse gate H, emergency medical response required, federal notification warranted. When Chief Boone turned to the cluster of commuters recording near the barrier and told them the transit authority would need those devices as evidentiary material in the department's investigation, Hollins told him without pausing that warrantless seizure of bystander recordings constituted a violation of federal law. She told him she would be happy to litigate that point if he wanted to proceed. He did not proceed. Judge Elroy declined the paramedic's offer of transport. He sat on a station bench near the gate, a transit medical officer examining his shoulder, and made 2 calls. The first was to the chief judge of the 7th Circuit. The second was to the FBI's Chicago field office directly. The Chicago FBI field office logged the notification at 7:21. 3 special agents arrived at Union Station within 17 minutes. They secured the scene, documented all recording devices in the vicinity, and placed the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division on notice before 8 o'clock. By 8:30, the footage was on every major news network in the country. The FBI subpoenaed the station's full security archive before 10, 6 cameras, complete synchronized coverage of every second from Dooley's initial approach through the moment the handcuffs were removed. The audio was clean, the acoustics of the Great Hall carried voices clearly across distance. Dooley's incident report, filed at 9:47 that morning, stated that the subject had been verbally abusive, had refused repeated lawful directions, had assumed a physically aggressive posture, and had posed an active threat to station security. 6 cameras contradicted every clause. Before smartphones existed, before cloud servers stored footage automatically, before 6 cameras were running in that concourse, do you think anyone in that department would have told the truth about what happened? Drop yes or no in the comments. And if this story should be heard by more people, share it. Most people still don't know how far this went. Dooley had submitted a body camera damage report the morning of the incident. He stated that his camera had sustained impact damage during a prior shift and had been non-functional since 6:51 that morning, 2 minutes before his initial approach of Judge Elroy. The report referenced a hardware fault code and had been countersigned by Lieutenant Price the same afternoon. FBI forensic technicians accessed the Transit Authority's cloud backup infrastructure 39 hours after the assault. The camera had not been damaged. It had been recording without interruption from 6:41 that morning. The footage showed Dooley at the priority corridor entrance at 6:51, watching the boarding area. He spotted Judge Elroy approaching the gate from the far end of the concourse, a man moving calmly, document bag in hand, credentials already visible. Dooley turned to the officer beside him, Officer Ryan Castile, 32, and said, with a visible expression of anticipation, that he had one coming who was going to be a problem. He told Castile he would handle it. He had not reacted to anything Judge Elroy did. He had identified him from a distance, decided on his approach, and moved to the gate entrance before the judge had covered half the distance between them. The damage report, forensic analysts would testify under oath at trial, contained hardware fault data that had been fabricated. The device logs showed continuous operation. The report had been filed with falsified technical information to eliminate the recording as evidence. He had designed the assault before it happened. He had documented it himself without knowing it, and then he had spent the rest of that Thursday morning trying to make the documentation disappear. Every prior complaint, every detained prosecutor, every redirected senator, every dismissed filing across 13 years was no longer a scattered record of individual bad judgment. It was a coherent operational history, insulated from accountability at every level above the officer who carried it out. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division opened a formal investigation into the Chicago Union Station Transit Authority Police 8 days after the assault. What investigators found extended well beyond one officer and one gate. Recovered internal communications revealed an organized scheme maintained by 7 officers, duly among them referred to in group text messages as the redirect. The mechanics were simple. Identify minority travelers in priority boarding corridors and first-class waiting areas and move them to general boarding through whatever means necessary. Weekly redirect counts were tracked, the officer with the highest total collected from the group. Lieutenant Kevin Price had not merely covered for the scheme, he had structured it. Recovered messages showed him setting weekly targets, tracking individual counts, and in one message noting that Dooley had been the top performer for 3 consecutive months and that his numbers were setting a standard. He had been running the operation with the administrative precision of someone who had no expectation of ever being audited. The 22 prior complaints against Dooley were re-examined with investigators who actually contacted the complainants. 19 responded, 17 agreed to go on record. A black federal public defender detained for 2 hours during a transit to a client hearing. A black Cook County Circuit Court judge redirected from priority boarding 7 times over 4 years, who had filed 7 complaints, none of which had been assigned a case number. A black retired Secret Service agent who had been told at this same gate that his federal retiree credentials were unverifiable without additional documentation. Over 12 years, 914 complaints had been filed against Chicago Union Station Transit Authority police officers. 88% involved black or Latino passengers. Not one had resulted in a sustained finding against any officer. Not one. The number was not a coincidence. It was the output of a system designed to produce it. The federal grand jury convened 6 weeks after the assault. The indictments came down on a Friday and reached into every layer of the command structure that investigators had mapped over the preceding weeks. Shane Dooley was charged with assault under color of law under 18 United States Code Section 242, conspiracy to deprive civil rights, filing false federal reports, obstruction of justice, and evidence fabrication for the falsified body camera damage report. His attorney, in a recorded conversation recovered during discovery, described the evidence fabrication charge as the one that would be hardest to survive. Lieutenant Kevin Price was indicted as co-conspirator on charges of conspiracy to deprive civil rights, obstruction of justice, and failure to prevent a federal civil rights violation. He had not passively allowed the redirect scheme to operate. He had built its accountability structure, managed its participants, and ensured that every complaint filed against its members was routed to a dismissal before it could be investigated. Chief Gerald Boone was charged separately with obstruction of justice and attempted witness intimidation. His conduct at the scene, the private office offer, the attempt to take bystander recording devices, the instruction to Diane Riley not to provide statements to federal agents until she had consulted with Department Legal Counsel, had been captured by 2 separate cameras. His attorney argued ambiguity. The cameras did not support ambiguity. Officer Ryan Castile was granted immunity in exchange for full cooperation and testimony. He described the redirect scheme in complete detail, the text message group, the weekly counts, the cash collections, the understood chain of protection running from the officers on the floor through the lieutenant's office to the chief, and the shared knowledge among every participating officer that complaints would be neutralized before they produced consequences. 3 additional officers from the redirect scheme were indicted on civil rights conspiracy charges alongside Price. The federal trial of Shane Dooley ran for 4 weeks. The courtroom was at capacity every day. Civil rights attorneys, constitutional law scholars, journalists from outlets across the country. 17 of the prior complainants who had come forward during the investigation, including the Cook County Circuit Judge and the retired Secret Service agent, were present in the gallery. The morning closing arguments were delivered. The defense argued that Dooley had responded to a legitimate and escalating threat assessment in a high-traffic public transit environment. His attorney described the body camera footage as incomplete context and characterized the redirect text messages as informal workplace communication that had been prosecutorially reframed to imply coordination that did not exist. The prosecution played the body camera footage on the courtroom screen without comment. The concourse entrance. Dooley at the gate, his scan of the approaching crowd. The moment he identifies Judge Elroy from the far end of the hall, still more than 100 feet away, moving calmly, credentials in hand. The turn to Castile, the expression, the words. No one in the courtroom spoke. Dooley took the stand. He said the footage had been presented without the context that would explain his assessment. He said he had no specific recollection of the exchange with Castile. He argued that the 22 complaints against him represented a coordinated effort by passengers who had been legitimately redirected and chose to retaliate through the complaint process. The prosecution presented the redirect text messages, the weekly count tallies, the cash transfer records documented across 18 months of mobile payment history, the emails from Price, the forensic testimony confirming that the body camera damage report contained fabricated hardware fault data that did not match the device's actual operational log. He had not made a poor decision under pressure. He had identified his target from across a public concourse, planned his approach, executed the assault, and spent the remainder of that Thursday constructing documentation designed to make the recording disappear before anyone found it. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. The verdict was unanimous on every count. Dooley was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and received a lifetime prohibition from employment in any law enforcement capacity in any jurisdiction in the United States. Price received 6 years. Boone received 3.5 years and forfeited his full pension. The 3 additional officers from the redirect scheme received sentences ranging from 2 years to 3 years and 8 months. 5 months after the criminal sentencing, Judge Marcus Elroy filed a federal civil rights lawsuit. The named defendants were Shane Dooley, Kevin Price, Gerald Boone, the City of Chicago, and the Chicago Union Station Transit Authority. The complaint alleged systemic racial discrimination, deliberate institutional indifference, failure to train, failure to supervise, and a sustained pattern of civil rights violations against minority travelers spanning more than a decade of documented, uninvestigated complaints. The city's legal team moved to open settlement discussions within a month of the filing. Their initial offer was $8 million, structured with a confidentiality clause and a provision restricting public comment by the plaintiff. Judge Elroy declined. His response carried no dollar figure. It carried conditions. A formal and public admission of wrongdoing, not a statement of institutional regret, a signed legal admission. Complete dissolution and reconstruction of the Transit Authority police force. An independent civilian oversight board with investigative authority, subpoena power, and zero departmental review capacity over its findings. Mandatory bias and civil rights training for every officer hired in the reconstruction. A federal consent decree placing the department under Department of Justice supervision for 10 years minimum. The city rejected the conditions. The civil trial ran 3 weeks. Expert witnesses walked the jury through 12 years of complaint data, 914 complaints, 88% involving Black or Latino passengers, 0 sustained findings across the entire period. One expert testified that producing that statistical outcome in the absence of active institutional suppression was not consistent with any probabilistic model that could be constructed from the data. The jury deliberated for 3 days, $23,600,000. $13,900,000 in compensatory damages covering physical injury, professional harm, and documented emotional and psychological impact. $9,700,000 in punitive damages against the individual officers and supervisors held personally liable. The largest civil rights verdict rendered against the Transit Authority Police Department in United States history. The city announced its intention to appeal within 30 days of the verdict. The appeal was never filed. The full amount was paid within 55 days. The Chicago Union Station Transit Authority Police Department was disbanded by order of the city. The reconstruction brought new leadership appointed through an external selection process, revised hiring standards with civil rights history requirements, mandatory body camera protocols with tamper-evident cloud archiving inaccessible to department personnel, and a formal policy requiring independent external review of every use of force complaint and every complaint alleging discriminatory conduct. The Civilian Oversight Board was constituted with full investigative authority, subpoena power, and a charter that explicitly prohibited departmental interference in any active review. A federal consent decree established 10 years of Department of Justice monitoring with quarterly reporting requirements. 19 additional complainants filed civil suits in the months that followed. Their combined settlements reached $13,200,000. 2 years into his sentence at a federal correctional facility in Terre Haute, Indiana, Shane Dooley agreed to a recorded interview with a journalist covering the long-term outcomes of the case. He said he had done what his training prepared him to do. He said the judge had escalated a routine interaction into a confrontation. He said the outcome would have been different if the subject had cooperated from the start. Judge Marcus Elroy was asked to respond. He said he had cooperated from the first word to the last word, credentials extended before being asked, hands visible throughout, voice level throughout. Every direction followed while being assaulted on the floor of a public train station in the city where he grew up. He said the cooperation framing was never about his behavior. It was about Dooley's premise that a black man standing in a priority corridor needed to earn his right to stand there in a way that no one else in that corridor was asked to demonstrate. He paused. He said he did not need to prove that he belonged there. He had belonged there. The cameras confirmed it. The jury confirmed it. The record confirmed it. He said the only thing left unresolved was the belief that had made it possible and that no verdict, however large, could fully resolve that on its own. 9 months after the assault, Judge Marcus Elroy walked through Chicago Union Station for the first time since that Thursday. His shoulder had healed. The torn overcoat had been replaced. He carried the same document bag, the same measured stride. His credentials were visible in his hand as he crossed the Great Hall, not because the new officers would question him, but because he had decided, somewhere in the months of recovery and litigation that followed, that he would move through public spaces in this country with his identification where it could be seen, not as an accommodation, as a record. The new transit officers nodded as he passed the gate. A young black man in a new uniform, part of the first cohort, hired under the reconstructed department, stepped forward and stopped him for a moment. He did not say much. 2 words. Judge Elroy looked at him. He nodded once. He walked through the priority corridor and was not stopped.
If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it, and let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next.